On a day in the Roman Senate, sometime in the early 190s CE, the assembled fathers of the empire were forced to open every session with a formal declaration. They were required to address their emperor not by his name, not by his title, but as Hercules, son of Zeus, conqueror of the world, the Roman Hercules. Any senator who hesitated, who stumbled over the words, or whose tone suggested even a trace of mockery, did so knowing that the man receiving those words had already executed colleagues for far less. Marcus Aurelius, remembered as the philosopher-emperor, the model of Stoic restraint, had left Rome in the hands of his only surviving son. What followed was 12 years that ancient historians recorded not as a reign, but as a prolonged catastrophe. Senators ordered to worship him as a living god. Commodus did not slip gradually into megalomania. He announced it. In the early 190s CE, he issued a series of formal decrees that restructured Rome's identity around his own. The city of Rome itself was renamed Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, the Commodian colony. The Roman Senate, the legions, the fleet, each was rechristened with variations of his name. The 12 months of the Roman calendar were renamed, one for each of his imperial titles: Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Herculius, Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, Pius. Every time a Roman wrote the date on a legal document, he was in effect writing a prayer to the living emperor. The divine framework Commodus chose was deliberate and specific. He did not claim kinship with Jupiter or Apollo. He identified himself completely with Hercules, the laboring god, the monster slayer, the divine hero who brought order to chaos through brute force. He appeared in public wearing the Nemean lion skin draped over his shoulders and carrying a gilded club. Statues across the empire were recarved. Existing images of Hercules received Commodus's face. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, who served as a senator during this period and witnessed these events directly, recorded that Commodus had the head of the Colossus of Nero, Rome's massive bronze statue near the Colosseum, removed and replaced with a portrait of himself bearing the lion skin and club, with an inscription identifying him as Hercules. The Senate endured this. They spoke the required titles. They voted the required honors. And they understood, with perfect clarity, that the man demanding these things was simultaneously filling Rome's arenas with blood and maintaining lists of names of men who would not survive the year. Rome forced to watch its emperor play gladiator. What distinguished Commodus from previous emperors who had indulged in arena spectacle was not that he attended the games. Emperors had always attended. It was that he descended into the arena himself and then demanded that Rome treat this as heroic. He fought under the gladiatorial name Paulus and adopted the style of the secutor, a heavily armed class of fighter paired typically against the net-wielding retiarius. According to Cassius Dio, Commodus participated in the arena on 735 recorded occasions. For each appearance, he charged the imperial treasury 1 million sesterces, a sum that Dio notes contributed measurably to Rome's financial strain during his reign. His opponents were not skilled gladiators meeting him in genuine combat. For the animal hunts, known as venationes, he slaughtered creatures from the safety of elevated platforms or enclosed passages where the animals could not reach him. He killed lions, bears, ostriches, hippopotami, and giraffes. In one session alone, reportedly dispatching 100 bears in a single morning without once stepping into open ground with them. He killed a giraffe, an animal Romans knew as a camelopardalis, a creature so exotic and rare in the arena that its death produced no dramatic response from the crowd. He had it killed anyway. But it was the human performers who revealed the full dimension of his cruelty. Cassius Dio describes Commodus gathering men who had lost their feet to illness or injury, fastening serpent-like padding to their legs to resemble mythological creatures, then entering the arena with a club and beating them to death while the crowd watched. He dressed other condemned prisoners as giants, as monsters, as figures from legend, providing himself the role of Hercules made literal, the divine hero slaying the abominations of the ancient world. The Senate was required to attend these performances. They sat in the stands and watched their emperor kill the defenseless for hours. When Commodus decapitated an ostrich during one such spectacle and walked toward the senatorial seats, holding the severed head in one hand and the bloodied sword in the other, the meaning was transparent. Cassius Dio records that he and his fellow senators were so gripped by the combination of terror and involuntary laughter that they chewed the laurel leaves from their ceremonial wreaths to keep their expressions controlled. A man in that moment who laughed could be the next figure handed a wooden sword and sent into the sand. Imperial paranoia, Commodus executes his own inner circle. The violence Commodus performed in the arena was theatrical. The violence he directed at Rome's political class was methodical. In 182 CE, 2 years into his reign, his sister Lucilla coordinated an assassination attempt. A young nobleman named Marcus Ummidius Quadratus Annianus confronted Commodus in a passageway beneath the theatre with a drawn sword and reportedly announced his intentions before striking, giving guards enough time to intervene. The conspiracy collapsed immediately. Quadratus and the other identified conspirators were executed. Lucilla was exiled to the island of Capri and then put to death shortly afterward. The failed attempt did not reassure Commodus. It confirmed what he already believed. He responded with a series of purges conducted largely through 2 successive favorites who functioned as de facto rulers of Rome, while Commodus occupied himself with arena preparation. The first was Tygidius Perennis, the Praetorian prefect who administered the empire through much of the 180s and who eliminated political rivals on Commodus's behalf. When Perennis himself became too powerful, a delegation of soldiers arrived from the Danubian legions in 185 CE to denounce him. Commodus handed him over. Perennis was executed, along with his wife, his sister, and his 2 sons. The man who replaced him was a freedman named Cleander, who purchased positions in Rome's administrative structure and sold them for profit with enough transparency that the practice was publicly known. By 190 CE, famine conditions in the city had produced riots, and the crowd in the Circus Maximus directed its rage specifically at Cleander. Commodus, whose sister brought him the news of the disturbance while he was outside the city, had Cleander beheaded and his head thrown to the crowd. The man he had relied upon for years became a piece of crowd management. By the final years of his reign, Commodus had begun compiling lists. Cassius Dio records that these were formal tablets bearing the names of individuals marked for execution: senators, officials, members of his own household. The climate this created in Rome was one in which proximity to the emperor had become, in practical terms, a death sentence waiting for its date. The conspiracy that finally ended the emperor's madness. The instrument of Commodus's death was not a senator's blade or a soldier's revolt. It was a woman who had spent years in his bed and who found her own name written on a tablet meant to end her life. On the last day of 122 CE, December 31st, Commodus's concubine, Marcia, discovered a wax tablet that the emperor had been using to record the names of those he intended to have killed. The list included Marcia herself, along with Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain, and Quintus Aemilius Latus, the Praetorian prefect. The 3 met. Their options were simple. That evening, Marcia mixed poison into wine and brought it to Commodus. He drank it. Then he vomited. The poison was working, but slowly, and the vomiting threatened to expel enough of it that he might survive. The 3 conspirators had a narrow window. They sent for a young athlete and wrestler named Narcissus, who served as the emperor's wrestling partner and training companion. Narcissus entered the imperial bath chamber and strangled Commodus to death. The Senate's response, recorded by Cassius Dio with barely restrained satisfaction, was immediate and decisive. Commodus was declared a public enemy. The decree known as Damnatio Memoriae, condemnation of memory, was issued. His statues were to be destroyed. His name was to be struck from monuments and public inscriptions. The months he had renamed after himself were restored to their traditional titles. The city he had renamed the Commodian colony became Rome again. Herodian records that when the Senate announced his death and began the process of erasing him, the assembled senators called out in formal denunciation that the murderer of citizens be dragged with a hook, that the gladiator be thrown into the charnel house. These were not spontaneous outbursts. They were ritual formulas recited by men who had spent years in that chamber reciting divine titles to a man who held the power to kill them for any expression of doubt. What Commodus had spent 12 years constructing, the divine identity, the new Rome, the rewritten calendar, the Herculean mythology, was dismantled in a matter of days by the very institutions he had humiliated. His successor, Pertinax, lasted 87 days before being murdered by the Praetorian Guard. The crisis Commodus had spent years generating did not end with his death. It accelerated. The ancient historians who documented his reign, Cassius Dio, who sat in those senatorial sessions, and Herodian, who lived through the period, struggled with a specific problem. How does a civilization that produced Marcus Aurelius explain producing his son? Commodus had not been corrupted by power gradually. He had, in Dio's reckoning, shown his nature early and simply found in absolute authority the conditions necessary for it to operate without restraint. The arena, the divine titles, the prescription lists, these were not separate crimes. They were expressions of the same logic, that the man who held Rome did not govern it. He owned it. And Rome, for 12 years, had no mechanism to correct that belief until 3 people found their names on a